Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's session of Spark at MIX, looking at the future of architecture. My name is Michael Platt. I'm a web architect at Microsoft Corporation. I have on the stage with me Anne Thomas Maines, who's a VP in the Burton Group, and Darren Hinchcliffe, who's the CTO of Sphere of Influence. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be having a look at what's happening in terms of architecture. We had a small meeting in the last couple of days, which was called Spark, and this is really about the feedback from that event. So the agenda is what is Spark? What did we actually do? Who was there? What happened? And so on and so forth. So there's a little bit around what is Spark, and then there's just a couple of slides around Web 2.0 and SOA. Presumably most of you, I hope, are familiar with both the Web 2.0 space and SOA. Actually, a quick show of hands. How many people here feel reasonably comfortable and confident they know what Web 2.0 is? Can I have a quick show of hands? Okay, and the same with service-oriented architecture, SOA? Good, so most people know what I'm going to be talking about. I'll just have like one or two slides to set the ideas in that space. And then we're going to have a look at what actually happened at Spark. We're going to have a look at the environments and drivers that are out there today, what's happening in the architectural space as seen by the people that were at Spark. And we're going to have a look at what principles we sort of came up with going forwards for architecture, the sets of models that we came up with that we think are going to be the sort of areas that we should be focusing on in the future, the inhibitors, the things that are going to stop us moving forwards, and then I want to throw it open to discussion. I don't have an hour and a half material here or anything like, but we're very happy to have discussion. And Darren are both up here, and we'll take questions from the floor, discuss it. We don't pretend to have the answers. I just said a moment ago, this isn't the answer, right? Architecture is a bit of a journey. This is we feel is next stage on the journey. There's obviously places beyond that we've still got to go to, but I think it's indicative of where things are going. So what was Spark? Spark was a two-day event that we had over the weekend. It was actually a day and a half, the whole of Saturday afternoon, whole of Sunday. We got 30 of the top IT architects in the world from a very wide range of organizations. There were supplier organizations, there were major customers, some of the major IT suppliers are in there, analysts, some of the smaller suppliers as well. Complete range of senior architects from those organizations. And we got them in a room for what felt like a very long time, and we discussed, where is architecture going? It was basically, okay, looking back over the last couple of years, looking at what's been happening with SOA, with Web 2.0, with software as a service, how can we see what's happened? How can we see the key elements to that, the common elements to that? How can we take those and sort of extrapolate them forward and say, what's going to be happening in the future? So that was really what it was about. As it says down at the bottom there, is examining the drivers, the models, and the challenges in architecture that we feel matter going forwards. And clearly a key part of that is how we integrate the Web 2 world with the SOA world, what the friction is between the two. We've been working for a while now in the enterprise space, probably 4 or 5 years now, on the whole area of services and web services and the WS Star stack. But now all of a sudden this whole mashup Web 2.0, mapping type stuff has happened very, very quickly on the front end. What's the implications of that? And I think there were a number of people at Spark that, for instance, commented that their large organization had an architecture and a model and a plan it was working to, but they were having customers their users coming back in who'd gone and done mashups at home, on their machines at home using things, and then they couldn't actually go and do that sort of facility and that sort of functionality back in their organization. And of course, that causes a lot of tension, a lot of stress in an organization. So what they wanted to know is, how do we take this really rapid ability to change and evolve, how can we take that and factor that back into the organization? So that was what it was about. These were some of the organizations that were involved. So you can see there's a wide range, people like Gartner and the Burton Group from the large analyst side of things, Oracle, Google, Microsoft from the large supplier side of things. And this isn't by any manner means all of them. This was just a range of the people. The MySpace people who gave a demonstration this morning at Bill's talk, whose name I've suddenly forgotten. He was there. They were both there and had some very interesting comments about, running 29 million user-based system. So, a wide range of people bringing together a wide range of understandings, issues, points of view, and so on and so forth. It's commonly said, you put two architects in a room and you'll get three opinions. In this case, with 30 architects in the room, we had an awful lot of opinions. So I'm sort of running through a fairly tortuous course here through a set of minefields of things that people agreed with or disagreed with. So this is a best cut. I'm not necessarily saying everybody would totally agree with what I'm going to say, but hopefully this was the sort of majority opinion rather than I would say that everybody would actually sign up to everything. So this is an idea of what the format was like. There was a certain amount of structure, but most of it was around discussion. You can see there on the right-hand side, a huge number of whiteboards and cork boards with ideas on, with models on. You can see some of the models on there. Some of the people participating. There were, as I say, it was a very interactive, very, very dynamic discussion. Everybody had a lot of great ideas. So what did we come up with? Well, first of all, we said, what are the characteristics of these two spaces, the consumer space, the enterprise space? And as I said, I just want to bring this back just so we understand what's meant to a certain extent by Web 2.0 from an architectural point of view, and what's meant by SURF from an architectural point of view. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's a number of characteristics for each of these spaces, and they are quite widely different. You have a very decentralized model of control in the consumer space, and you have a very centralized control in the enterprise space. How does that tension work out? Again, the same sort of side of things in management. One of the interesting things in the web space, in the Web 2.0 space, is just the sheer numbers of users. I mean, the whole area of scale, it becomes a very large issue. It's an issue in terms of you have to provide a platform which can be managed and can run to those very large sizes. Say the MySpace's people this morning said, they went from 9 million up to 29 million. I don't think too many enterprises are actually running 29 million users internally. I don't suppose anybody is actually. So those levels of scale are absolutely huge. I think that the largest enterprise in the world, I think, is actually the Indian train system, and I think they're only a few hundred thousand, maybe 1 million users or something like that. So you can see that when you start getting into the consumer space, the numbers get very much larger. Another interesting thing, of course, is the connectivity, and the devices have become much wider in terms of range and scope, and also in terms of the power that's out there. I think that's there are 4 times as many phones shipped in China at the moment as there are PCs. You can see that sort of growth. A phone nowadays is a very capable device. It has a tremendous amount of power in it. I think Bill talked a little bit about phones this morning. And when you start talking about these new form factor devices out in the consumer space, again, a lot more interactivity, a lot more movement in that space, and you start to see the way that the device is used changing very dramatically and very quickly. It is an interesting point, the way that we tend to think that consumers, working in large organizations, you tend to think that consumers don't change very quickly. But actually they do when they're doing things they want to do, right? When you're trying to sell them something, or you're trying to get them to use your website, it seems to be a very slow and tortuous process sometimes. But then when it's actually something they want to do, like share music or something like that, things happen really quickly. And so we have to take that into account. Both models, interestingly enough, are very much a loosely coupled asynchronous model. There's a big difference in the way that they're looked at. There's the more formal method with standards using WS star, and then the REST approach that the consumer space tends to have. There was quite a fair amount of discussion around this. I think there's a couple of comments. This is a personal comment rather than anything that came out of the meeting. And that is that, I think a lot of the discussion about the difference between REST and WS and SOAP in particular is not actually too much about REST, because REST is an architecture. It's about HTTP against SOAP. And I think that you have to think about the usage of HTTP, and that certainly came out, the usage of HTTP against SOAP, and then going up the stack, some of the high-level things. But in particular, a lot of the concepts that were behind the original REST paper, I think, are very valid across both platforms. I think that a lot of Fleming's original work in his dissertation about REST architecture is very valid whether you're in the enterprise or whether you're in the consumer, and whether you're running on top of HTTP or WS star. And so that gives you a little differentiator between the consumer and the enterprise space. We then started to say, well, okay, so what does the world look like out there? You know, what is the environment that organizations and consumers are working in? And what are the main areas? We did some exercises where we captured a whole load of questions, comments, and observations, and then we tried to cluster those. I actually had an idea. It's like a lot of these discussion things. I had an idea before we went into it what we'd get. It wasn't actually what we got. So yet again, I was proven wrong. These were actually the main areas that we got. We got a business area of business, you know, what's happening in business. We got an area around control. And there was a lot of discussion around change and control. You know, how do we manage to allow change to happen very rapidly at the same time maintaining some level of control? You know, clearly the web out there, the Web 2.0, there's very little control, but a massive amount of change and vice versa. So there's a lot of discussion around that. The whole area of collaboration, and then again, how do you do this on a global scale? Interestingly enough, there was nothing here around technology. There was very few, you know, nobody felt there was anything very much coming through from the technology space to drive a lot of work that's going on. And I think that's actually my personal feeling as well. I mean, this is mainly a technology conference, obviously, and there are some useful frameworks and tools and so on and so forth, which you can use, and clearly AJAX and the whole asynchronous model is very important. Although to a certain extent, as Bill said this morning, you know, we have been doing client-side browser-based asynchronous processing for quite a while. Now that's obviously grown and built up, but it was interesting, as I say, nobody really came up with any fundamental technologies which are driving this, and I think that's probably true. My personal feeling is that there's a whole load of things around business and social changes that are changing what's happening rather than technology change. We've obviously increasing amount of bandwidth, increasing number of devices and so on and so forth, which is helping, but there's no fundamental technical change. So these were some of the things that we felt in the business space were drivers, and clearly the whole area of business models and what new business models are coming through was it very important, and the whole area of business model innovation. And again, talking to customers, I talk to a lot of customers, obviously as part of Microsoft, and the people we're tending to talk to are the people who are working very closely with the business. They're not so much the dyed-in-the-wool IT shops. They're people who are saying, well, actually, you know, we have to go and build a business in this Web 2.0 space. One of the people that was there was actually from the company that owns Orbitz, and you know, so the whole travel space. How can you use Web 2.0 concepts into that sort of space? How can you use, you know, how can you use some of those ideas and concepts, and what's the business model going to look like going forwards? And that can be very tricky, because whilst there's a lot of new products out there in that space, not many of them making money, and in many cases it's not actually very easy to see how to make money off them either, especially, you know, as in many cases the services are given away for free. That implies some sort of ad-based revenue. I think the whole Google thing, where Google's made all this money out of ad-based, obviously makes people feel that they can give away things for free and make money out of it. And also, I think rather unfortunately, it has raised this perception in the user's mind, in the consumer's mind, that they can get things for free on the web, or most things on the web should be free or no charge. So there was a whole raft of stuff around monetization, and of course, you know, how you do that through transactions, microtransactions, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of talk about the long tail as well. You know, pretty well everything at some point then becomes a long tail when you use these sort of business models, and therefore, of course, serving those long tail micro markets. It was felt that this whole the whole point about the Web 2.0 side of things was it was very much a global selling type of things. Although again, most of the mashups, interestingly enough, are based around US only. I mean, there's not many mashups in the UK for a start. Somebody that's English guy. I mean, the actual map resolution in other countries is very poor in comparison with here. But I think people can see that eventually that's going to spread out, and it will become a global thing. Low barrier to entry was a very important point. In many cases, people are putting up websites, mashup sites for pretty well next to nothing. If you look at things like Craigslist, I think he still runs with like 8 people or something like that. Sorry, 18. Yeah. I knew there was an 8 in there somewhere. 18. Craigslist runs with something like 8 people. There's a lot of sites out there. There's an education site, a set of sites called Moodle, which run with about 4 or 5 people. These are very small numbers of people, and so it doesn't take long or cost a lot to get these things going, especially as the technology provides such a high-level framework in order to work against. And one of the things that you'll see from this conference, and I've certainly seen, is the way that the technology framework is coming up and up in terms of capability and the ability to just drop things onto web pages and do things very simply. And then finally, this bottom one here, which I think was brought up a couple of times, and I've already alluded to a little bit, and that is this whole idea of consumer to enterprise. And something that came through very strongly in our discussions was the importance of the user. And interesting enough, Bill said this morning, he thinks that the user is key. And that was certainly something that we said as well. It was certainly something that came out. And if you go and start saying, the user is the center of all this stuff, then the user, of course, is not just the user in terms of a customer to you. They're actually also inside your organization as well. So the user is both out there as a consumer and also as a provider. And we've got some really interesting models, which we'll show you later on around this. But basically, what happens is that it means that if they see something out there, they come back into the organization and they start causing the demand in the organization for that sort of facility. And of course, Microsoft knows that very well, because Microsoft has done an awful lot of very effective selling using that model. I've yet to see an organization that defined Windows 3.1, for instance, as its global desktop, or indeed as Office 1 as its global word processing and management package. But clearly, people bought the thing personally and then bought it into the organizations, and over time, organizations had to actually adjust to that. An interesting case, again, came up in the discussions I had, where there was an organization which had locked down its users, and it said you're not allowed to blog internally, you're not allowed to use wikis, any of the Web 2.0 technologies are not allowed to be used because we can't control them. And of course, what happens is that then customers, their users actually start going and building wikis outside the organization, because there's no reason why you can't put up, I think it's like $3 or $4 to put up a wiki somewhere, per month, and there's no reason why you can't put up a wiki and then start doing work on the external wiki, which is even worse for an organization, of course, because now you don't have any security other than what's provided by a third party. So just saying we are not going to do these things just doesn't really work. I mean, the whole fortress mentality just really doesn't work in these areas, and that's been shown time and time again. If you don't pick up this stuff, it's just going to happen anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. So the next area was under control. And follows on quite nicely from the example of people building wikis out on the web, of course, because then you start to have a whole lot of issues around threats and trust and relationships. Can you trust somebody or not? Can you trust a device? And again, Bill talked about this morning, about how can you trust somebody, either a person or indeed a device working on behalf of a person? How do you know about phishing and so on and so forth? So that was quite interesting. And that then's based around relationships, and I'll come on to that in more detail. And then the whole area of compliance and monetization came under control as well. I think I'll come back to it again. One of the key issues we talked about a fair amount was the conflict or the balance between the control and the change. One side you want to control things, and the other side you want to allow change. How do you provide that balance? Again, this is a personal opinion, so I'm not saying that everybody agreed to it, but my feeling is that an organization, we think of an organization as having a fairly fixed boundary. Organizations used to have a brick and mortar boundary. Now they have an internet boundary, a firewall boundary. And I think we've got to think beyond that, and we've got to think about a much more transparent organization, and how we allow transparency, and how we allow a graduation of control. So obviously at the center, if you're doing banking transactions, I personally want my bank account to be pretty locked down. But then as you go further away from that, then you have to make sure that the organization has this levels of control the further it gets from that central point. So again, I think that's an important model. We come back to that in some points in the future, but this idea of a transparent organization I think is important. Interestingly enough, it actually has quite a big advantage, because you can actually, in making an organization more transparent, it can give you some very significant competitive advantage. To give you an example, no, I won't give you that example on Second Thoughts, because it was probably confidential. Okay, so moving on then, change. So how do you build for change? And this concept of throwaway applications. There's a chap who wants to buy an Xbox 360, and we're having trouble meeting the demand, or were having trouble meeting the demand. So he built an application which would go around and poll all the different local stores and tell him when one of them had that particular had an Xbox in stock. And of course, when he'd finished with it, when he bought his Xbox, he then just put it on the web, and people could then go and pick it up and use it. So he built the application. It was so quick and easy that he could build that application, just for that one-off use, and then throw away afterwards. And I think we'll see more and more of that. These very fast throwaway, fast-built applications. So that's at one extreme of the building for change. So you're thinking about how do you make sure that you actually think about building these things very simply and very quickly. User-based development, I think, is going to be a very interesting one. And again, there was some discussion about this. The concept here is that, and again, actually, I think Bill talked about it this morning, is that VB originally, in BASIC and VB when it first came out, was for the users. It was a very simple-to-use environment. Over time, we've made it more and more sophisticated, and gave it more and more capability. And of course, that means it's less and less easy to use. So what seems to happen over time is that a language becomes more and more sophisticated, and then becomes less usable, and you start to see people then start to build new languages. So you see things like, a lot of the work that's going on with JavaScript, and now moving up into things like Ruby and languages like that as well. So this demand for user-based development will always be there. This demand for different levels of sophistication of the user base will always be there. And it's important that we realize that, and we provide the tools to do that. Okay. I can't remember what the asymmetric demand was about. Can you?
Yeah, there's the fact that you never really knew exactly what people would be using your system for. And so you designed it for one particular type of demand.
Okay.
But then you have all these other different groups coming in from all different sides, using it for completely different things than you originally thought of.
Yeah, so as I say, what I did was I picked up all the discussions and all the whiteboards, so I put them together on the slides. Not all of the slides can I remember all the points on, because I built this morning, so you have to bear with me. Yes, you're right, now I remember the discussion. Asymmetric demand was literally, you build it with a particular usage model in mind. You may well find that the users have a very different usage model, and you suddenly find your demand blossoming in ways you weren't anticipating. Interest, again, the gentleman from the BBC this morning was saying that in the UK the most pirated video TV programs come from is in the UK, and I suspect that's one of the asymmetric demands that he was talking about. Collaboration, the whole area of collaboration, the collaboration space, and we're seeing, this came back to my point about changing social models and this whole generation of the user. There are people nowadays are growing up. I have kids. I have a number of kids. Too many, it feels like sometimes. And what they're doing now is very different from what we were doing, or even the generation that's now 25, 26, because you're seeing TV demand dropping off very dramatically as they start to go online more and more, do a lot of their shopping online, do a lot of their communications online. You saw the demand from MySpace this morning. And of course, that also starts to generate things like user-generated content. In things like music, obviously, there's a number of new bands springing up there. There's people starting to do video content and movie content as well. Hands up, who's heard of a thing called Red versus Blue? Right. Red versus Blue, for those who don't know about it, is basically where somebody took an Xbox game. It's Halo, I think it was. It was Halo, yeah. And they used the multiplayer mode to generate a little sort of little movie, and they captured that with a screen capture, and then they overdubbed it with some text, with some voices, and they built it into a series which was wildly popular with probably the people put their hands up who've got kids, but you know, it was wildly popular in the sort of high schools for a while, and we'll see more and more of that sort of machinima user-generated content coming through. At the same time, you'll also see a lot of user-generated content coming through in terms of metadata. So there's a site called Last.fm. Hands up who've seen Last.fm? Last.fm is very interesting because it doesn't actually generate, it doesn't actually have any content at all. They're beginning to put content on there, but it was actually built around a non-content model. What it does is, what you can do is you have a toolbar you add into your browser, and you then go and listen to music. And as you play the music, the toolbar pops up and says, do you like this or not, basically. And if you like it, then it will log that you like it. And then it logs that attention data back up onto the servers. And over time, it says, you know, if you like this, you'll like that. It's much like Amazon, the Amazon book list type thing does, but without actually supplying the actual content or the books themselves. It is just capturing this attention data. And actually, it's very powerful because then you start to see, well, you know, other people like these sort of things. You can start to navigate through. So don't think of user-generated content in terms of people actually writing Word documents or doing podcasts. You actually can think about just them going to places actually starts to generate content. And especially when you have very large numbers of people, 29 million or whatever, that becomes a very significant amount of content. It becomes a very interesting amount of data. Then feeds into the whole area of search and discovery. Given all this information, how on the earth do you find things? You're probably familiar with the whole tag cloud business, you know, where more people go to things, you start clouding information up, and we'll see more and more of that. But we'll also see, I think, some much more sophisticated ways of finding things that are of interest to people. And when you think about it, actually, of course, Google obviously fits into the whole search and discovery model, but moving forward, into images and stuff like that, we have to be much more sophisticated. Again, I think the gentleman from the BBC that said this morning, we have to start thinking about metadata tagging of video because you can't really search on video that easily. So how do we go about that? He said, can't remember how many hours of video they had, but it would certainly be a significant problem. So that fits into the whole community space, and obviously we talked a little bit about content, ranking and rating. There was a fair amount of discussion about the whole /dot, how you can say these people are more likely to be correct than these people. And on Xbox Live, for instance, again, I'm not a gamer, so I keep using games as an example. I'm not actually a gamer, but to give you an example, Xbox Live, when it first came out, you could go and have the audio and talk about what's going on in the game, and you've got all these young teenagers, generally male teenagers, just sitting there screaming abuse and very unpleasant words day in, day out over the audio, which of course rather ruined it for everybody else. So in the latest version, there's 5 levels of gamers, and you can actually vote somebody up or down the level, and so all the screaming kids go in the bottom category, and anybody who wants to listen goes in the upper categories, and you start to see this whole ranking and rating business. And fairly soon, we'll actually start to see, just like you have in eBay, you know, you have your ID, and that has associated with it a level of responsibility or whatever. I think we'll start to see those sort of things, the ability to say, well, actually, you know, I have this sort of level on eBay, so therefore I should really be able to take that somewhere else, as almost like a mini credit rating. It's going to be very interesting when that happens. Check devices and networks, and access and connectivity were a couple of key ones. Again, the mobile phone is everywhere. Thank you for the, you know, the mobile phone is everywhere. Mine is now wireless as well, wireless enabled. We'll see more and more. I feel I'm on email the whole time, and we will see more and more of that. The whole boundary, both to the devices and then back into the organization, will start to change. The amount of networking that you have, the ability to coming here, going up into the rooms, I find it very frustrating when I actually have to pay for wireless access. My perception now is that you should have that for free. And you know, walking around, we actually provide it in the halls here, clearly, because that is becoming the perception. Although actually hotels charge a lot of money for phones as well. So clearly there is a point where you can charge. So these are all sort of collaborative things that are going to change the collaborative network, collaborative area. In terms of scale, it was all about this instant deployment, permanent beta software services type thing. You've got this huge levels of bandwidth, huge numbers of users. How do you make your applications, your platform scalable? How can you actually just plug in more machines and just go up and support the very large numbers of devices out there, and at the same time provide sort of global operations across the whole thing. So you can see there are a whole raft of things that were scale things. We had a couple of people from some of the big hosting providers, and they had some very interesting comments, and as indeed the MySpace people did, about how you build a system to scale up and to start to support very large numbers of users like this. So we then went back around and we said, well, how do we aggregate all these drivers into some sort of sets of principles? And the first principle that we came up with, and as I say, Bill said it again this morning, is that the user is the center of this. We felt very strongly that the whole thing is going to become very user-centric, and then there's a number of things that hang off that. And basically what architecture, and to a certain extent the IT industry, should be about is how we actually facilitate things like business advantage, things like the balance of control, things like change and growth, and things like the connectedness and scale, how we facilitate those things with sets of models going forwards. So these are the basic principles that came out of Spark as the areas that we felt architecture and technology in general should start to be able to support and facilitate. And so from that, we then ended up with, we went and said, what are the models, what are the architectural models that we feel are going to facilitate this? What can we build our future systems on? How can we integrate this Web 2 and service-oriented world? And we came up with these three models. There's the Tree of Life model, which was very graphic. I liked it a lot. There's the whole area of edge computing, which is actually a model that we've been using internally inside Microsoft for a while. And certainly elements of that came up, and I'll just cover that in more detail. And then there's the Spark model, which was a model that we got by sort of munging all the other models together into one meta model. And it's needless to say more complex than the other three, but so that's why I'm going to put the other two up first to work into the most complex. But they all actually had some very fundamental assumptions and some very fundamental basics that they came from. So I'm going to start off with looking at the Tree of Life model. Hands up, who knows about the Tree of Life as a matter of interest? It's remarkable, not many. I thought that most people in our group did know about the Tree of Life, as I reckon.
No, actually, it was just Nick. And
was
all
it?
Of us, yeah, for the rest of us, it was all Nick.
I come from a while back from Scotland, so I knew about it. Yes, it is. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So well, this is the Tree of Life, you see. It's the concept is you have a tree, and what are the trees? I think they're banyan trees or something, where the actual branches go back into the roots. And it's the Tree of Life. It's this completely circular, connected thing. So I'm going to pass over to Anne on this one, because this is her model and her group's model. So over to you.
It wasn't mine by myself.
Oh, sorry, her group's, I said.
We had a group of people who did this. But essentially, all the other models that we produced actually had the user at the center. This was the only one that actually put the business at the center, and the users are on the outside. But the idea is that you have a business, and the business has a supply chain, which is the suppliers and the producers. That's a set of users to the business. And then the business also has a demand chain, which is going out to the consumers and the distributors. That's another set of users. We also, this is actually not indicated in this particular picture of the model, but it's fractal, and so inside the business itself, you have a whole group of additional trees of life inside, and that's all the internal users within your organization and their relationships. But the idea is that there are such complex relationships that exist now for both the consumers and the providers that they tend to actually loop back into each other. And you're sharing a huge amount of content between them, and then from all of this enormous amount of content that you get from the consumers, from your distributors, from your providers, from your suppliers, and from your internal organization, and from that you should be able to distill some business intelligence and have this constant loop back and forth. Another thing that is not actually demonstrated in this particular picture, though, was the idea of the long tail. And so you know, at the roots, you'll notice that, you know, it's very thick in the center and it gets thinner as it goes out to the edges. So that's essentially the concept of the long tail. So you want to be able to serve your core market, but you also want to be able to serve the long tail, the folks that are on the edge, the micro markets on the edge. And that's true for both your supplier-producer type environment and for your consumer and distributor type environment. One of the other things that we were trying to express here is the idea of service networks. I don't know how many of you have ever read The Only Sustainable Edge by Hagel and Brown, but it's actually talking about the fact that you have to, you know, your individual business really needs to focus on its core capabilities and continue to build and make those capabilities more prosperous. And anything that's not a core capability should actually be consumed from someone else who has that as a core capability. And so you wind up developing a network of all the different other companies that you are interacting with. And so there's this requirement for your business to be able to very easily integrate with many other types of companies. So that's the supplier-producer world. And likewise, the way you now distribute your stuff to the outside world, you want to be able to take advantage of other capability providers out there who can now consume your stuff and help distribute it out to the outside world. And so you've got these networks, service networks, both at the top and the bottom. And obviously the relationships between all these different systems are enormous. And of course, Web 2.0 type technologies can help facilitate that type of collaboration that now becomes required among all the different companies.
Thanks. Yes, I'm sorry. This talk is filtered a little bit by my memory of what happened, and a little bit by my graphics ability, which is very small. So I didn't manage to get the long tail effect on this. Okay, this was another model that I think again talks much the same sort of thing. So we have surface-oriented architecture at the bottom and Web 2 over the top, and then you have this concept of some sort of composition layer to build applications over the composition both for data and applications. So that works in a sort of mashup world in the Web 2.0 space, and you can pull that down into the server space and start to provide a lot more agility. But the core columns that bind the web world together and the enterprise world together are based around things like relationship management, which includes trust and security and those sort of things. I talked a little bit about already. The whole area of rich content, how do we provide this multi-dimensional, high bandwidth type content, the whole area of collaboration and discovery. So these four pillars tying things together, I think was certainly a model we've been using internally quite successfully to start thinking about, well, how do we, for instance, with the live technologies that are coming out, how do we start providing relationship management into the live world? What sort of things are required there with our live products? And then finally, this is the model, the sort of Uber model, the one we pulled together from the other models at Spark. Again, I apologize straight away for my graphics capability here. You can tell the difference between the ones done by the professionals and mine. But equally, it's not got the standard Web 2.0 graduated fonts and formats and all that sort of stuff. So you can know this isn't a Web 2.0 presentation. Basically, the whole thing starts around the user, and the basis for all of this is the user. The user is the center. The user is the most important element. But then on top of that, you actually have this concept of a consumer and provider, and this comes back to the tree of life thing. The user is both the consumer and the provider. They're both sides of the same coin to a great extent. And then you have two arrows, one on the left-hand side, which is as you get closer to the edge, you start talking about edge power, you start talking about a lot more devices, a lot more bandwidth, all those sort of things. You also start to enable a lot of the long tail effect, and you're much more capable of changing and much more rapidly. As you come away from the consumer side of things, you start to see much more control, much more standardization, and the ability to make money becomes much easier because we have much better understood models when you start coming back towards the provider side of things. So that's the basis for the platform. We then actually start to put on top of that some layers. And the first layer is the whole area of open and scalable services. And really, you actually in both cases, whether you're talking about the Web 2 world or whether you're talking about the SOA world, it's all about services. So how do you build these big open scalable services? We've been talking about services in one form or another for a while now. And so that includes things like messaging and loose coupling. It includes what the applications look like that sit on top of that. It includes things like monitoring, and it includes the data. So that's stuff that we've been talking about for a while. It's pretty well understood in the architectural world. We're trundling away at that. But what we put over the top of that straight away is this area of trust and relationship. So it's not security, it's much more than that. It's how do we understand how to trust somebody, and when you should trust somebody, and what level of trust they can have, and then finally, what are the relationships they have both to the site, to the provider, to other users, to other consumers and other providers. And you start to see at this level bubbles of relationships sitting on top of these services. And it's easy to think, well, this is all going to be held in an Active Directory. There's going to be this massive Active Directory in the sky. But actually, of course, the real world's not like that. And people are actually putting a whole load of their personal information into websites all over the world. In fact, there's probably more sort of identity information held in one-off websites scattered all over the place than there is in all the Active Directories there are. So, what's that going to look like going forwards? We have InfoCard from Microsoft, as one element of that, but that's just a fairly small part of what needs to be done in this space. Because you actually, as I say, once you've started to be able to understand identity, you then need to start to say, well, this whole area of relationships becomes very important. So in a case in point, if you go to somewhere like Flickr, you have your logon, but then on top of that, you have your friends and you have your family. But why don't you have work group? These are the people at work I work with. There's no reason why not. And by the way, perhaps that should be integrated with some sort of work Active Directory system. So you can see how those sort of things start to bubble up, and vice versa, of course. If you may well not want somebody to be your friend as well, and you get into the whole area of buddy list and things like that. And we're seeing a lot of this coming out of MySpace, and how people are interacting on MySpace, and what sort of trust and relationships and what social interactions they want to have. So then we stick on top of that. Once we have this trust and relationship layer, then we can start to think about how we build communities on top of that, and how we can discover things drilling down into these lower layers. So we have a community and discovery layer, and then finally we actually put the content on it. And this is where I was sort of motivated by the Tree of Life thing, and I'm thinking more like a Klein bottle. Any hands up who's familiar with a Klein bottle? A Klein bottle is actually a bottle which doesn't have any inside, right? So it's sort of twisted back on itself. You look it up, it's an interesting model. And so to me, this is where you take your user and your consumer and provider model, and then you build it into this Klein bottle, which comes back in at the top again, where the content is the inside and the user's on the outside, sort of as a single shaped, three-dimensional shape. So think of the content of this drilling right down through. And so, as I say, not only talking about the specific content that people are generating, and again, user-generated content I think is very important, but also this whole area of meta content, linkage content, who trusts what, who's interested in what, who's listening to what, attention data. There was a conference last week, a week before last, eTech conference, which was around the whole theme of attention and attention data. Who owns the attention data? You go and have a look at something on Amazon. It will say this is what you came and looked at last time. Who actually owns that? I mean, I would like to have my own copy of that. I would like to know what books I'm interested in, and so on and so forth, and take that to another site rather than have it always on Amazon. So that whole area of content and meta content is I think really key. And you can then look at this model, as I say, from the top. You see the content, and from the bottom, and you see the user, and there's some sort of relationship between that as well. So this was the final model we came up with for how we can tie all these things together into a single model. Now, the nice thing about having a model is it allows you to sort of prioritize things, see where things are missing, see what other elements need to be done, what barriers there are to moving forward, and that's where we went to next. Oops, no, I just want to cover what's in each of these areas in a little bit more detail for you, and then I'll talk about what's missing. Right? Okay, so under community and collaboration, these are some of the sort of things you can think about when you're starting to build a community and collaboration system. Again, you can see these all sit on top of some sort of relationship management system. Yeah? They need that sort of understanding and facility. They need both the data and actually the applications to have attributes which are associated with your usage and other people's usage and who you want to access and who you don't want to access. But that's, as I say, that you can see some of the sorts of things that are going on. Back channeling is an interesting one. There's the whole area of discovery and how you find things up into ranking, rating, and then into the whole clouding space. I think there's some very interesting things around, given this attention data, how do we start being able to use it to find other things that are of interest? How do we start to raise things up in terms of profile? Again, the chap from the BBC this morning showed you pictures where you know, he was actually able to go, okay, I'm interested in drama, and you could actually zoom that out using the facilities in Vista. And again, you can see some architectural ideas behind the usage of those things. Talked already about identity management, friends, family, and group I talked about. That, of course, then is associated with access management, because you know, you want people to access certain things, certain objects, certain applications, certain systems can be accessed not only by individuals, but by groups and by other elements on behalf of those groups. So you then get it. I can remember, wow, back in the early days of NT, this whole concept of passing authorization across from one system to another was a big problem, and I can see it's going to rear its head again on the web very quickly. Personalization, if you know a lot about somebody, you know what their interests are, then of course you can now go and personalize the system, and that's pretty much what GreaseMonkey does today. I think we'll very soon see, you know, you have a personalized format that you like, and pretty much everybody else is pumping XML at you to actually go and render that. And then how you build that into these groups and tribes and taxonomies. And in terms of content, we started off you know, a couple of years ago with image and audio. We've gone more recently into geographic. And then as the bandwidth's increased, we see more use of video and TV, and then going into movie. And I think, as I say, the other thing that we'll see, that the gating in terms of data and the richness of data has been bandwidth. I think the gating around the whole area of metadata is our understanding and standards. So hands up here who've looked at microformats at all. Microformats are going to be very important. Again, notice Bill talked about it this morning. The demo where you cut and paste, I don't know if anybody's done the demo of cut and paste on the internet. Has that happened? I've been doing the slides, so I went to Bill's talk. It has. You actually need to have, when you do that, if you're cutting and pasting between websites, you need to have a standard format. And he does, and Ray did it, of course, with href, which is a microformat. But there's a whole raft of other formats that are needed. And so this whole area of microformats and community and user-based formats is going to become really, really important. So, you know, it doesn't matter what business you're in. If you're making, I don't know, widgets for cars or something like that, very soon you're going to find that the users are saying, well, actually, you know, I'm actually going to say the car representation of this data is such and such, and to a certain extent, the suppliers are going to have to meet that. Case in point, I actually have a Land Rover which broke the other day, and I went up onto the web and I went through the Land Rover manuals. It was actually the computer that broke, and the Land Rover manuals weren't terribly useful, but there's a guy up there who's got a wiki. There's a Land Rover wiki, and the Land Rover wiki had a huge amount of information in there around how to fix the Land Rover, more than was in the manuals, because there were people who are actually working with them all the time. We're actually updating this wiki, and so I was able to take that, and the tag in the wiki, he'd actually tagged the parts I needed, and they weren't the same tag as the part number that Land Rover were using, but if you actually clicked on the part number, it went to the suppliers, and the suppliers all understood that wiki site's tagging. Yeah? So this is a point where a Land Rover part number is being superseded because actually the users are using their own way of tagging that data and directing you to it. So I was really surprised. I mean, that is a microformat in the making. You'll see a lot more about that. And I've already talked about attention data. So as I say, one of the nice things about looking at building models and architectures is it allows you to go and see what are the inhibitors, what are the challenges, what are things still need to be done. And this was a list of the areas we felt were inhibitors. things like quality of service, user control, factor for user composition of both applications and data. This is was one that certainly resonated with me. We have to actually think when we're building web pages, applications, data, how do we actually build them in such a way that they're easy to composite? How do we build the tagging and the attribute information to do that? In many cases, that we need to do things that perhaps are not very easy to do inside the browser or indeed even in the PC. And again, the limits of that, and Bill alluded to a little bit of that around sort of GPS. When you start to have all this GPS information available, you need to move outside the concept of the browser because you may be getting that off the phone. Scale and storage, we talked about internet scale. It's a very frightening thought. You could be slash-dotted and suddenly you've got 10 times or 100 times the users that you've ever had before. How do you actually scale for that? And again, that's to a certain extent, I believe, around the whole area of state and how we manage state. Monetization models, most of the Web 2.0 stuff doesn't seem to have a very good business model behind it. Most Web 2.0 companies seem to be working on the principle that they get bought by somebody rather than they have some sort of sustainable business. Now that will work up to a point, but there's got to be a little bit more behind it than that. Building for emergence, can't remember what that was about. What was building for emergence, do you remember?
Encouraging unintended users, but if you don't do that, you can't achieve them.
Right, okay. And again, we talked a little bit about metadata. So those were some of the inhibitors. That's, okay, I've got a list up there of places to go to for more information. In particular, there's a blog, Spark Las Vegas, WordPress.com. We're putting information up there. I blogged about it yesterday. There's some links up there to all the pictures that were taken. There was pictures of all the models and so on and so forth. They're up on Flickr, so you can go and see how the models defined. I've got a blog as well, which I will go and update tonight after this. And of course, the Microsoft architecture sites as well on top of that. So that gives you a quick idea of what happened at Spark. We had a ton of really useful information. This is a very early distillation of that information. It's me spent this morning and this afternoon and some of last night sort of going through and trying to distill it down to a set of slides so that I can present it today. That process has still got to go on. But as I say, we did get a huge amount of knowledge and information from these, and over the next few weeks we'll start to munge that together into more detail so that we actually have some really solid models to work forwards and some really solid areas to work on. So over to you. If there's any questions, I or anybody else here is very happy to take them. I'll throw the floor open. Has anybody got any questions? Yeah, if you go to the microphones, that'd be good too.
I had a question. You just touched on the attention data on the near last slide there. Where do you think that's going? Who do you think is going to be involved? And who's it going to benefit?
So the question was around attention data. Where's the whole attention data space going? And who's going to benefit from it? To me, attention data is one element of the whole metadata space, and it's a very important one. I think it goes into this whole area of relationship. I believe that that there's going to be a lot of focus in the whole area of relationship and identity and trust and attention in there. I think people are going to realize that data is incredibly valuable. So if you go and look at things like Last.fm, it really strikes you very quickly how valuable that stuff is. There's an interesting sort of balance because people will only give up information like attention data if there's something in it for them. And it has to be a pretty good, strong reason why they should give it up as well, actually. People generally don't give out personal information unless there's a good reason to do so. So your site has to be providing some benefit to the user. There was the 3 reasons why people, why people start to use new systems, which we came up with, which I didn't put on a slide. I did think I would. And as I recollect, it was, it has to be useful for the individual, it has to be useful for the group, and it has to be useful for a corporate as well, right? Otherwise, unless all 3 of those people get some benefit from it, then it's not going to happen. So I think at the moment you can see there's benefit from the user. There's benefit from people like Amazon being able to hold that for individuals. Then the question is, who owns that data? Now, personally, I believe I own it, or at least I believe I should have a copy of it, or be able to get a copy of it. That's not happening today. You know, it's held up on those websites. I think that what you'll see is people start to build websites where you can take your attention data and put it somewhere else. I think you'll see the same thing with identity as well. You know, you can take your identity information and move it to a different site. Both either hold it on your own local machine or actually hold it in another machine in the cloud, and you define where it is. So I think you'll see that, and I think you'll start to see a sort of the typical race, you know, where, okay, I can take my attention data, I can put it anywhere, and I can share it with anybody. The attention data will itself become a micro format. You know, so you will have standard formats for your interest in music. I could see that very easily, you know. This is how we think about the format of data of attention for what I'm listening to. And then once you've got that as a micro format, you can share that around and you can move it to different places and you can store it on other sites. And then people will come back and say, well, you know what, if you use our site, we will give you this additional information. So you'll see one of the typical arms races going on. So that's why I think it's going.
We came up with another interesting idea there, which is eventually someone will, or multiple people will actually start providing services that can take your personally owned attention data, and so you can go to a service and say, tell me what other people might like, and particularly do it in terms of my peer group. And so, you know, it's like I have a certain amount of demographic information about me, and I want to share that with you so that you can actually provide me with more specific input that, you know, here's what I like, but here's what other people in my peer group like, as opposed to simply, you know, here's what everybody else in the world likes. So it gives you slightly more valid things. So, you know, the idea is that we were presenting was we think it's important for the end user to actually own their own attention data and then be able to share it and have control over it. I mean, that was one of the core themes of the whole day, is that the user must be in control of their experience, of their data, of their identity, of their whatever. And you need to be able to share on your own terms rather than on somebody else's terms. And the question is whether or not somebody out there is actually going to provide you with that kind of capability. And I do think that there is opportunity for businesses to try and come up with new business models that might make that work.
I think I agree with Anne on that. I think, you know, there's another couple of, you know, 10, 20, $30 million businesses out there around that space. I mean, you can sit there and look at it and say, whoa, there's a huge demand. It's pretty easy to see how that demand's going to be met in some way or other. Obviously, building products is a bit like cooking in a way. You know, you've got to get all the right ingredients at the right time, at the right temperature, and that obviously is implicit. But there's definitely a really nice meal there for somebody or other.
Also, the folksonomy stuff comes into play because you actually want to start using, you know, the folksonomy tagging type systems to help identify the certain characteristics that you're looking for.
I think there will be a kind of an attention crisis when people actually become fully aware of how much of their information, their attention data is already leaking out. Like Google and MSN already record the information, the search terms that you use are tied back to your IP address. They record all that information, all that attention data is already being stored, and I don't think people fully realize that yet. When that happens, there'll be a backlash, I think, against people who really want to start hoarding their attention data.
Go ahead.
So first, I just want to thank you guys for a pretty excellent talk today. It's a lot harder to take 2 days of brainstorming and do a presentation than it is to demo Atlas, but I think there's a lot of people here that really want to get the early information, the raw information, and get access to some of the thought leadership that you guys are working through. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.
My question is, you sort of started off the slide deck today with the drivers that's causing all of this change, and you accurately pointed out, I think, that technology isn't one of the primary drivers, and yet all the people in the room are IT architects, the world's leading global IT architects. So the question is, who do you guys think should be in the room alongside of us technologists to really answer some of these questions.
14-year-olds?
14-year-olds, yeah. I'm lucky in one way or another. I've got 7 kids, or mine, I hasten to add, just in case. And Anne's absolutely right. If you watch the kids, it's amazing. It's amazing what you learn. But I think that actually is a really interesting question. It's something that I've been thinking about for a while, because we have a fairly solid idea of what architecture is and what architects do. And so we have an infrastructure guy who does the infrastructure of an organization. We have a solutions architect or an application architect who can architect these big applications. And we have an enterprise architect in large organizations who sits there and sort of says, we're going to try and tie all this stuff together in some way, which is really difficult because they almost always get it wrong. But what's interesting is that there appear to me to be another group of people, which is what I think of as strategic architect. And Bill's title actually is Chief Strategic Architect. And actually, I think it's quite accurate, because I think that there are a group of people who sit there and they say, well, we know roughly what can be done in technology, and we can see a lot of is becoming available in the platform, and we can see how that and we can see what's happening in terms of society and business, and we can munge those things together to actually come up with a new business area or a new business idea. So I say the gentleman from the BBC, I think, was that sort of architect, And I think the question there about attention data was the same sort of question. How do you think about the demand for attention and what's going on in that space, the technology, and so on and so forth? And I think what we're seeing is that we're seeing these people that are very, very closely allied to the business. They're working either in a small startup where they actually think, okay, we can actually make a business out of this, or they're working in a large organization saying, how can we think about using microformats in, I don't know, in Land Rover or something like that? So there's these people that are not what we think of as conventional architects, but are people that are trying to come up with new ways of doing business. And that's what I think. Those are the people that I think they are. Yeah.
It was interesting. We actually commented at one point, I think yesterday afternoon, about the fact that there was no one in the room who was under 25, and I think there was only one person who was under 30. And we're saying, maybe we don't actually have the right mix of people in this room. It was just a really amazing concept there. But
the next generation of the web will be built by the next generation.
It's true. I always knew I was too old.
You said the next step in this would be to continue to digest this material, which makes me wonder, what is Spark really? What is the intent? What is the group? What is the long-term activity here? I mean, is this some kind of virtual consortium we see forming?
That's a good question. And so the intent of the meeting was to say, and my personal intent, which because I was there at the formative of it, is that I actually get really fed up with all the buzzword and the hype. There is some value, there is something behind SOA, there is something behind Web 2.0, but so much of it is just hype. And you then get into a lot of discussion, and people sort of diss really good ideas because it's got bound up in the hype. And so my idea was, well, before the hype starts, let's try and put this something onto a solid technical basis where we've actually looked at it in a reasonably well-formed manner, rather than people coming up with Web 3.0 or Enterprise 3.0 or all these other. I mean, I've got nothing wrong with that, but it would be nice to get people together and say, well, actually let's have a bit of informed thought about this, rather than who can think up the next buzzword fastest, right? Which is, to a certain extent, why I haven't put up a name or anything like that. So that was my idea, was okay, how can we get some people together, think about where we're going in the future. Clearly, we've got to integrate the consumer space and the web and the enterprise space. What's that going to actually look like as a real architecture? Can we have a model for it where we've had a lot of people look at it, a lot of smart people who've got a lot of experience in it, and actually put into that, and not be focused and driven by the buzzword and the marketing hype. So that was why I did it, why I asked my boss to go ahead with it, and he very kindly stumped up the money and gave me the support to do it. And I'm very pleased with the outcome, because I believe we came out with some very strong principles, very strong models, which I believe we can distill down. Ongoing process, I'm not sure. That's up to a certain extent to my colleagues. Norman's at the back. Norman? So Norman at the back there is busy thinking, as we speak, I suspect, about what the next steps will be, but I'm certainly hoping it's an ongoing process.
Hi.
Hi.
I just have one question on the model, which I thought was very interesting, the final model you came up with. And the one thing I'm just worrying about is what's not really present as a model for what content is. I mean, there was a lot of talk for what content, in the end, content becomes the single segment in the middle.
Yep.
But really, there was a lot of talk about content as also the trails that users, the so-called users or people flow. Content becomes the attention data. It becomes everything. Content becomes not simply a unit, a picture, or a video. In fact, content becomes very thin. Content becomes more of a vector than an object. And that seems to be, if we think along those lines, we can construct slightly different business models about how we are targeting. Because generally, most business models kind of circle around this idea of the content element rather than this idea of motion. In even the extent that advertising, you target search engine advertising based on what you're trying to find rather than maybe the journey that someone's doing rather than the final point.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think content, you can think of it as the object. I love the idea of a vector. I just love it. I mean, to me, I've always thought about attributes that are associated. I mean, it comes into real play when you have an image because it's easy to search on text. It's a lot more difficult to do the search on image data. So then you start to have attributes and tags associated with that. And when you have enough of those, you're right. You end up with some sort of vector associated with the object, which I like the idea a lot. I totally agree with you. I think if I was a betting man, which I'm not, which is strange being here in Vegas, I would say that probably over the next couple of years, when you look at the sort of businesses, the new growth in area, number one will be around the whole area of this relationship, specific attention data, and what that vector looks like, which comes back to that gentleman. And then beyond that, it'll be, more generic vectors that come from content, from information. We will start to see how we can see where interest or discussion or whatever is going depending on the usage of information, which to a certain extent what Google does today. So I think that if I was going to go out and try and make $1 million tomorrow, I'd go and look in the relationship management space. But beyond that, I think that you then start to say, well, actually, what does this vector look like of content? What does the metadata look like in more detail further out? I haven't got a clue what that looks like, I hasten to add, but that's my feeling. Go ahead.
I think that content is a feature of the web, and that it'll be user-generated, it'll be micro-chunked, and then it'll circulate in the information ecosystem, and people will monitor its attention, they'll try and monetize it, they'll track it, they'll share it, they'll collaborate on it, they'll syndicate it, and that's going to be the focus. There'll be users and the content in little pieces.
One of the drivers you identified was the internet is the platform. Well, we had 5 or 6 different versions of that, and the web is the platform. We also identified the fact that content is the platform. Right. And you think about what Mashup is all about. It's how can I use the content that's out there to build interesting new applications. So if you take content as a whole rather than as an individual component, right, as an individual bit of content, but you take content as a whole, suddenly it becomes this amazing platform that you can start figuring out new and exciting ways to use technology. Now, we had identified the fact that there isn't a lot of new technology out there, but what really is innovative is the way people are using old technologies to do really interesting new things. Right. Now that we have this content that's out there. You think about it, 10 years ago, we wouldn't be doing any of this stuff because there wasn't the content out there. But now there's so much rich content to choose from. It suddenly gives us a platform to do much, much more interesting things.
Yeah, I agree. And indeed, in the mashup space, at the end of the day, the application itself is trivial. Yeah. And the tools they used were incredibly basic. Mm-hmm. This is not about building the world's latest, greatest application. I mean, all the mashup stuff isn't about how fantastic the language was or how fantastic the application tools were, or indeed how fantastic the application itself was. It was about pulling data together. So it's, I think the last 15 years have been around application building, object-oriented. Let's go and build new. I think the next 15 is going to be around content. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Kalia Hamlin, and I'm Identity Woman, and I work with the user-centric identity community a lot. But one of the things we've been talking a lot about is the social and legal norms. And a question that I wonder about is what came up in your workshop around those, and whether we can have the legal infrastructure sort of keep up with the pace of this change?
I think I left it off. I can't believe it. It was definitely a big one. Was the whole area of IP. Again, this is me doing the slides very quickly. Huge area. Legal and IP, absolutely.
Well, not just IP, also like sort of our Fourth Amendment protections, the way the Supreme Court has interpreted any third party holding data means we're not protected in the same way we would be if that data, if that stuff is sitting in papers in our house. And I think there's, with the current political situation, I'm quite concerned about all my data being held by third parties without those protections. And, is there a place where sort of that set of concerns is being dealt with by the industry as a whole, and can you see that happening?
I think there will be, because I think it's a huge issue, especially, again, coming back to detention data stuff. I don't think people realize today just how much information is being held about what they're doing. I mean, Google does hold a huge amount. And the recent court case, where the FBI, was it the FBI? It was the FBI. Somebody wanted the information from Google, and Google...
Google is now required to actually hand over all the search.
Yeah, that's right.
And very unsettling.
It is very, do I really want people to know that information? Yeah, it's like, I'm not sure I do. Not that I go anywhere that's particularly bad as it happens, but I totally agree with you. I think there's two issues. First of all, there's the, capturing information which you're not even aware of, and then there is actually information which you're perhaps slightly more aware of and being captured up. Both cases is huge areas of privacy around that. Yeah.
Well, the third point up there, user control, is bringing some of that part into it. The user needs to be in control of his or her own information. Yeah. One of the conversations that I had at my table was about health information. It's really, really, how did we ever get to the point where the patient no longer owns the patient data? The doctor or the hospital or whatever organization it is that collects your tests actually owns that information, and you don't. And you go to a new doctor and you have to fill out all kinds of forms to transfer your medical history from your current doctor to this new doctor. It's like, this is ludicrous. And it's like, how do we fix this? I have no idea. I cannot figure that out.
I think the legal, like a lot of things, the legal system is going to really struggle. There was an example I gave where the Zagat, who do the restaurant guides, they wanted to actually have the ability to not, once you've found a restaurant and a review, you wanted to be able to go and book it, so you could pass it through to Ticketmaster. And they actually came up with a contract between themselves and Ticketmaster, which had to be a formal contract because money was being passed backwards and forwards. And they produced this as a complete technical contract. And if you actually start to build these things as a technical contract about all the information that's being passed, they had to do that because they're doing it as a service, passing information from one service to the other. So they knew all the stuff that was being passed. And when they actually tried to get the lawyers to sign off on it, they just couldn't do it because the level and the detail in the information that they needed to have as part of the technical contract was far more than was able to be handled by the laws that were out there. The lawyers just sort of gave up at this point. They said, in fact, you still can't do it for exactly that reason. The reason wasn't a business reason why you couldn't tie these services together. It was because the contract and the law that we have out there at the moment isn't able to cope with a lot of the concepts, like who owns what information. That has to be understood when you're doing these things technically. So I think that a lot of social systems we have today are really going to start to creak and groan. The legal one being one of them. I've had a number of run-ins with the American legal system anyway, so I'm not a great fan as it happens. So any other questions? Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.